You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and powered by Overtime Media. I'm your host, Chad Jensen, and with me, as always, my partner in crime and co-host. You know him, you love him, as the lead NFL writer for Heavy.com. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, we were kind of chit-chatting about what we've seen from the first couple slates of NFL action in Week 1. What do you think jumped out to you the most? Let's start with our most recent conversation that we just touched on briefly. Did you see a regression of the magnitude it appears to be from Baker Mayfield this year? I mean, hopefully it's not a trend and there's no reason to jump to conclusions, but we haven't seen that version of Baker Mayfield since he entered the NFL. It's scary to say the least.
Yeah, we were just talking about this, like you said. I was not expecting this at all from Cleveland. We were both huge Baker Mayfield guys. I still am. I bought into the hype with the Browns this year. That team is just stacked. It's loaded. They brought in Odell. Baker looked like a franchise quarterback last year. But something, I don't know if it was Week 1 jitters. I don't know if it was a letdown game early on in the season, but they did not look like the new Browns. They look really like the old Browns at home, getting shellacked. Baker threw multiple picks. It just it was not the team that had all this offseason hype. The team that I bought into, they kind of made me feel bad for supporting them so much.
We talked about this, but it's the biggest question mark, I think, for the Browns all offseason long, as exciting as all this talent. I mean, they have all the talent in the world. They have the quarterback. The biggest question mark was the Freddie Kitchens hire. And as I mentioned earlier, it's like the inmates running the asylum. That's the feeling I get. Whereas I think this is a team that, Greg Williams, he's been a head coach in the NFL before. He was the interim head coach last year after Hugh Jackson got fired. He helped get this team on track, made them respectable down the stretch. They decided to give the job, though, to the offensive coordinator, Freddie Kitchens. And to me, that just kind of smacked of placating the quarterback. Is there any discipline in that locker room? That's the biggest question right now. Is there anyone on that coaching staff the players really fear? And that's, I think, going to be one of the predominant themes following the Browns throughout this season is if Baker Mayfield has to be the heavy, I mean, he's only a second-year player. That's just not a recipe for success.
And, not just with the Broncos, we've said it, before Vic Fangio was hired, but coaching. It's all what it comes down to in the NFL. And the Browns, at least for 1 week, at least for today, proved you can have all the talent in the world. You can have your franchise quarterback on the roster. You can surround him with so many weapons. But if we're hitting at it is true, if you have questionable coaching or inexperienced coaching or lacking coaching, it is always going to come out. It is always going to be that denominator that proves a winner or loss. I still think they're going to have a good season, the Browns. I still think this was an outlier, not the rule for them, but it was definitely not an encouraging start. This was a weird Week 1 though to begin with, Chad. There was so many different things that went on, a lot of injuries to Nick Foles, Tyreek Hill, Pat Mahomes was banged up. It was just a really odd kind of opening week for me.
Let me ask you this: which of these following two quarterback performances do you feel like, talk about an outlier, which one do you think is more of an outlier, and which one do you think is more legit, something that's going to be duplicatable throughout the season? Lamar Jackson's performance against the tanking Dolphins or Dak Prescott against the Giants?
Let me say that Prescott is set up with a roster that's as loaded as the Cowboys have been since their Super Bowl glory teams. So I don't think that's going to be just a 1 week thing for Dak. I mean, he is really feeling himself this year. He's in a contract here. He's going to get a big extension, but he just has so many weapons in that offense, and it really is looking like Super Bowl or bust for the Cowboys. Lamar Jackson, I wasn't as high on last year. He literally couldn't throw the ball, but you're playing a tanking team in the Dolphins. It's one thing, I wrote this on Twitter, it's one thing to tank, but it's another thing not even to try. What an embarrassment the Dolphins were to step out on a field and take home a paycheck for that, to get blown out by Lamar Jackson at home. It was a deplorable effort. I don't think that will sustain in Baltimore. I think they have a good ground game, good defense. Lamar Jackson will prove he's not as bad as people made him out to be. I just don't think he's as good as 5 touchdowns a week.
I thought that the hand-wringing over Case Keenum's first half for the Washington Redskins, it was making me crack up on Twitter. Everyone's like, look, this is what you do when you play to a quarterback strengths.
Right. I got the same mentions. Yeah,
It's like, look, dude, Did they win the game?
He also missed a receiver down the field. He had that one big hookup, and then he missed a streaking wide open receiver. He just threw a duck. That is who Case Keenum is. And it's no surprise that he might have started out good, but he just can't make those throws in crunch time like he missed that one at DT last year. He's just not that type of franchise quarterback.
The other two AFC West teams who played on Sunday, one, the Kansas City Chiefs beat Jacksonville, and then the Los Angeles Chargers. It looked like they had this game against the Colts well in hand, and then Jacoby Brissett and the combination of him, Marlon Mack, and T.Y. Hilton brought the team back, but that defense was just gassed in the first drive of overtime, and Rivers drove him down and punched it in for 6, end of game. So right now you got the Chiefs, you've got the Chargers with 1-0 records tomorrow night, Monday night, as you guys are listening to this tonight. The Broncos and the Raiders will throw down. So the Broncos they don't really have any time to lose. If they want to keep, tread water with these two perceived leaders of the division, they have to get cracking. So today we got a few things we're going to dive into to kind of not so much really talk too much about the Raiders game. I think between the 3 different podcasts on our shows here, we've pretty much dialed in everything you need to know about the game. But there are some things that came out as it relates to your Broncos over the weekend that Zach and I are going to dissect for you. Got a couple questions from guys we're going to hit. But first, a couple of quick matters of business. You guys, make sure you're following the show on Twitter, especially all of our new listeners on Apple Podcasts and all of our new listeners on YouTube and across all the Android listening apps at Huddle Up Pod. That's how you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the show in real time, is by following us on Twitter at Huddle Up Pod. You can find Zach on Twitter at Kelberman NFL, myself at Chad and Jensen. Now, if you are interested in being entered into the giveaway, the drawing that we do each and every, now that the football season is upon us, we're going to be doing this each and every month. You got to go to Apple Podcasts and leave a creative review. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star rating. What's going to happen is, just like in August, at the end of September, we're going to randomly draw a name or two from the hat of people who entered reviews in Apple Podcasts, and we will send out some Mile High Huddle and some Huddle Up Pod swag at the top of October. So if you haven't done that, take care of some business. Fantasy football season is here, and this season there are more ways to win than ever, because FanDuel has more ways to win cash prizes and once-in-a-lifetime experiences during every single game, every single week. If you never played FanDuel Fantasy Football before, that's great, because new users get $20 in-site credit if they deposit $20. Each and every year, fantasy football helps hardcore fans like us, and even the casual fans, to get that much more passionate and involved in the NFL regular season. But don't get stuck in a lineup that you're going to regret. With FanDuel, you can pick a new team each and every week. FanDuel is way more flexible with your options, and the injuries and busts, guess what? They don't end your season. Plus, you get the chance to win millions of dollars. Sign up for FanDuel now and get $20 in total bonus. Just make your first deposit of $20 to get started, and you'll get an extra $5 in site credit every week for 4 weeks. Go to FanDuel.com/DFS Fantasy. That's FanDuel.com/DFS Fantasy, or download the FanDuel app.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, let's touch on really quick the biggest, well, really the only thing as it relates to Monday night's game that we need to touch on here, and that is the injury report for the Denver Broncos. The final injury report, of course, came out on Saturday, and there's a couple of questionable situations here as it relates to your Denver Broncos. First and foremost, Andy Janovich, Joseph Jones, we knew those guys were not on track to play. They're out. Todd Davis officially listed as doubtful, and the Broncos they said they'll probably make a final decision on Davis, not at game time, but probably on Sunday. So that's probably already been decided. But here's where it gets even more sketchy, Zach. Bryce Callahan, who was on the injury report all week with that foot, limited on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, officially questionable for Monday night. How big of a concern is that for you?
I'm still not ready to press the panic button on Callahan just yet, but we've been talking about it for the last couple months. It's concerning that foot which hindered him last year, which affected his free agency stock, it's still bothering him after all this time. And Vic Fangio, previously in training camp in the preseason, kind of getting annoyed that Callahan wasn't available. Even if he plays, I would imagine he's limited to some extent. They probably have a certain amount of plays for him, certain packages for him. And this is where the depth in that secondary is so valuable. That's why it's so valuable to still have a guy like Chris Harris Jr., an all-pro, to have Kareem Jackson back there, to have some young players in that secondary you can build around. And if Callahan doesn't go, you can get by with. I want to see him play, but it's so tricky with the foot. You have a cornerback who relies on his backpedaling and stuff like that. You don't want him to suffer a re-aggravation. So I want him to play. I want to see him out there to see what he can do in this defense, but I don't want to risk him being longer than he's already out.
Yeah, this is going to be a game that I would guess Bryce Callahan's going to be on a little bit of a pitch count. He'll probably start the game. My guess is he's going to go. He's questionable, not doubtful. My guess is he's going to go. But the Broncos are going to be smart with how much they play him. They kind of have to be at this stage because the season's just kicking off. And as you said, they don't want to overdo it now and lose their second best corner for any long stretch of the season. So that's where Isaac Yiadom comes in. That's where Devontae Bosby come in. They have, both of them showed some strong indications that they're turning a corner in their respective careers as cornerbacks here. So I think with Antonio Brown, which we can touch on in a little bit here. I mean, I don't think any of our listeners have had any of the shows up to this point really comment yet on Antonio Brown. We'll get to that here in a second. But Bryce Callahan, man, if he doesn't suit up, I think the Broncos will be able to handle business because besides now the Brown's gone, there's no one really in that Raiders receiving core that scares me.
Right, that's a great point. I mean, you have Hunter Renfrow in there, and you have Darren Waller at tight end, but without Antonio Brown, that offense is kind of one-dimensional. I don't know what Derek Carr is going to do, probably run the ball a lot. So, yeah, this game, and I would even venture to say, Chad, next week's game against the Bears, they have Allen Robinson, but not a really explosive receiving core. I would think, though, he'd be back, Callahan, hopefully, for that Green Bay game. That's one quarterback in Aaron Rodgers. You're going to need all your weapons and all your strongest people on the field. But, yeah, if he sits out this game, if there's one game for Callahan to miss, I think it's this one, Chad.
Josh Carney had a great film article over the weekend breaking down, this was before the news of Antonio Brown's release came out. He said, look, enough of Antonio Brown. Everyone knows he's going to get attention. Here's two sleepers, though, that are probably going to factor into the Raiders' offensive game plan a lot more than people are really thinking right now, and that is wide receiver free agent acquisition Tyrell Williams, formerly of the Chargers. Most fans can remember him, and then also the rookie running back Josh Jacobs from Alabama. That's really going to have to be, with a little Wallers sprinkled in, Oakland's tip of the spear when it comes to things offensively. So, bottom line, though, if the Broncos had to get by one regular season game without Callahan, this might actually be the best opportunity to give him that rest. Probably doesn't come down to that. I think he's going to play, but it's a situation to monitor. Now, Zach, what was let's just one quick topic on this and then we'll move on. What was your reaction finally to the way things resolved with Antonio Brown and the Oakland Raiders?
I mean, I was surprised that they released him, but I wasn't surprised at all that he signed with the Patriots. I mean, as soon as that move was made, I and everyone else had the same joke on Twitter, and it actually came true. And it's sad that Antonio Brown and Josh Gordon on the same Bill Belichick coach team with Tom Brady as your quarterback, that is pretty terrifying. But the way it ended in Oakland, it is one of the strangest, oddest, most captivating storylines I can recall in quite some time, between the frozen feet, the helmet, him calling the GM a racial slur, then finally forcing him out after signing him to a big deal. I have not seen anything like that, and all you can really say is only the Oakland Raiders.
Amen. All right, well, let's get to the other big piece of news that broke over the weekend for the Denver Broncos anyway, and that is the fact that Joe Flacco and the Broncos restructured his contract. Now, basically what happened, just to give you guys the quick deets, and then we're going to go through the implications in a fine article that Bob Morris published at milehighhuddle.com over the weekend. But here's what happened. So the Broncos basically converted $17 million of Flacco's 2019 salary into a signing bonus, and then they added 2 additional years at the end of his term, and they're voidable years, by the way. The Broncos did not change his base salaries for 2020 and 2021. They're basically $20 million and a quarter, and then $24 and a quarter, respectively. Neither of which are those seasons guaranteed. So from here on out, he converted his 2019 salary basically to a $17 million signing bonus. But from here on out, just like before this, I should say, restructure occurred, even though he added 2 additional years to his deal, each one he's basically playing on 1-year deals. It's a series of 1-year deals. So the Broncos, if things don't go the way the Broncos want to with Flacco, they can get out. Now here's what I want to get to is by doing so, Zach, the team freed up about $12 million in cap space. So they're sitting now with about $12 million in cap space. And next year, they're projected to have $54.2 million in cap space. So next free agency period, now they have a few of their own they're going to need to get re-signed, but the Broncos are going to be able to throw some weight around next year in free agency. But before we get to these implications, what was your gut reaction to the Flacco restructure?
I think it was a smart move. It's not really, torpedoing the cap in future years. You're not kicking the can too far down the road. And you get some much-needed cap space now because the Broncos were really cutting it close. They couldn't even afford to sign another big-name player after Theo Riddick. To me, as soon as this move was made, though, I got some questions on Twitter. Everyone's asking, what's this made for? What do they have in mind? People were saying Trent Williams. I don't think it's an outside acquisition. I think they made this move. This was my gut reaction because they have so many in-season extension candidates. Justin Simmons leaps out to mind. Shelby Harris, Adam Gotsis. They have so many players they can lock down between now and next offseason and kind of save themselves some money by not letting those players hit the open market. It's, locking up your talent now rather than later, which I think the Broncos had good foresight to do, and now they had the money to do it with.
Again, great article by Bob Morris at milehighhuddle.com. It's the lead story right now. Probably still is as you're listening to this, so go check that out. But I want to go through these 10 implications. We'll try and rapid fire them as we get through this article. But Bob starts this out with, number one, the question is, was this the right move? And I don't see any way in which this was a wrong move. I don't see how this move could be criticized because not only is it freeing up the cap space, but the Broncos really didn't put any more on the line, so to speak. Yes, they added 2 additional years to his deal, so he's under contract for 4 more seasons following 2019, but they're all voidable. They're all voidable. The Broncos can get out of each one with little to no cap ramifications. So to you, Zach, number one being, was this the right move? As you so accurately pinpointed there, it frees them up to whether it's signing guys if they suffer injuries, they can sign free agents, or extend guys in season. Is there any way you could see this backfiring on the Broncos in any way?
I don't think so because they had no money, and you need money to, assemble your roster and keep the cupboard full. I mean, look at Jerry Jones in Dallas. He had money and he's spending it to lock down his young talent. That's what the Broncos should do if they're smart. To me, again, Justin Simmons is one name that just screams to mind. He had a tremendous summer, and I think he's going to have a breakout season. And just take care of him now, not let him get to the open market. But there's no downside to this move. We already knew they're committed to Joe Flacco for this season. More than likely, I would say next season now, considering Locke is battling an injury. So we already knew it's going to be the Flacco show next couple years. But like you said, they have voidable outs in that contract. They can get out of it with minimal financial penalty. There's no downside to this and all upside because now you can lock down and secure the young talent and build around them.
Okay, here's implication / question number 2. Was there another contract that could have been restructured instead? Here's what Bob says just really quick. There was. Von Miller has 3 years remaining on his current deal. His deal expires just before Bradley Chubb would enter the 5th-year option of his first-round rookie deal. In Miller's case, it would have involved a short extension, say 2 years, that would allow the Broncos to lower his cap number but keep him around for the next 2 or 3 seasons following 2019, then, if needed to, move on when it would come time to invest into Chubb. So, there are a couple other. Well, really, it comes down to Miller. If you're really looking to free up money, I don't see any other strong candidate. Maybe Emmanuel Sanders, but Von Miller was the only other option. And I'm of the opinion that if you're going to fiddle with money at this stage, it's probably better to keep it with Flacco, who you don't really have a long-term commitment to, than perhaps upsetting the apple cart in any way with Von Miller and his representation.
Right, spot on. That's what I was thinking too, because of how acrimonious, negotiations were a couple years ago before his big deal. And they're going to kind of come to a head in the next couple of years. Von Miller, John Elway, the Broncos front office, he's going to want another big deal. And now you have Bradley Chubb kind of taking the torch over. I don't think, like you said, Chad, Elway at this point wants to do anything that would upset Von Miller and take away his money or move his money around, whatever. So yeah, there was no other really candidate to free up some money with. Flacco was absolutely the right choice and the only choice.
Bob goes on to list a few other candidates in his third point, including Derek Wolfe, but even Chris Harris Jr. But the Harris thing, we've touched on this a million times now on the podcast. The Broncos are very much in a wait-and-see mode as it relates to Chris Harris, and Harris is as well. He wants to test the free agent waters next spring. So let's jump to number 4. What's the deal with the voidable years? Here's what Bob says. Voidable years are a mechanism by which teams spread out a signing bonus over additional years than they would otherwise. In Flacco's case, he had 3 years left on his current contract. The Broncos restructured $17 million of his base salary and spread it out over 5 years using the voidable years tactic. That means a $3.4 million cap charge in each of the next 3 seasons, then the same cap charge in 2022 and 2023 for the time being. So, the voidable years in Flacco's, let me finish it for what Bob said. Flacco's 2020 cap charge rises to $23.65 million from the $20.25 million, and his 2021 cap charge rises to $27.6 over what originally was $24.25. So that's something to keep in mind, is that because they converted that $17 million, they freed up into a signing bonus. They freed up that $12 million, but it also inflated the cap number for 2020 and 2021, Zach.
Yeah, but this is a really nice maneuver by Mike Sullivan, the Broncos cap whiz, is freeing up money, still converting it to a signing bonus to placate Flacco, while leaving yourself the option of getting out of his contract and not being tied to a 34-year-old signal caller for the next 3 or 4 years. They can get out of this deal, and they don't have to be all in for the long term. They could, if they want, transition to Drew Lock, to another quarterback. So there really is no downside to this move, and it's a great article breaking down the specifics of it and the money aspect of it, because so many things go into that. A lot of fans think it's just actual money on the salary cap on the line and dollars and cents. It doesn't work like that. There's so many different variables that go into play, and the way they handled this Flacco move, taking on his contract from Baltimore with that big extension, there's really no downside, nothing you can really hate on.
All right, number 5. What's the impact for getting out of the deal in future seasons? Bob says, quote, the Broncos could still move on from Flacco after 2019 because they didn't fully guarantee his 2020 salary, meaning they wouldn't owe him that $20.25 million if they cut him before the start of the 2020 regular season. However, a straight cut in 2020 before June 1st means that $13.6 million would come in dead money with a $10.5 million in cap space freed. So if the Broncos, because of this extension, or not, I guess technically it's an extension / restructure, they are going to have some dead money if they ended up moving on from Flacco next year.
Yeah, it's based on, a quarterback's contract. There's always going to be some penalty, just like anything else. And if you want to break your contract, let's say at your phone company, for us, us mortals, there's going to be a penalty for that. In the NFL realm, it's no different. So if they want to move on from a 34-year-old, highly paid former Super Bowl MVP signal caller, it's going to cost them a little bit. But what they gain in terms of cap relief, for the most part, and also the chance to usher in a new young quarterback potentially, I think it's a move they would have to make, and they would have no problem making if it meant that, to move it forward. On
that same number 5 point, that implication that Bob highlights there, one thing I want to point to is, unlike a lot of these free agent deals where teams have to make a decision before a new league year begins, in Flacco's case, because he has no guaranteed money in his deal nor any roster bonuses that must be paid on a certain date, quote here from Bob, the Broncos don't have to cut him before the start of any new NFL calendar year and designate him a post-June 1st cut. They can simply wait until after June 1st to cut him. So what that means is, if the team plans on at least testing the waters of whether or not 2020 is the beginning of the Drew Lock era, they can either let him battle it out, they can wait to see how Lock looks in camp before they make a decision on Flacco.
Yeah, and that's the best case scenario. They can really let the cards, play out on the table and see what they want to pick and choose from. And that's the way to go. That's how you transition from a bridge starter, I guess you could say, what Joe Flacco is, maybe a short-term franchise quarterback, to your potential face of your franchise, whether that is Drew Lock or somebody else. If there was a way to do it based on the way they kind of backed into a corner with Case Keenum and all the failed quarterback moves they've made, it could be a lot worse.
All right, we still have a few more points here from Bob's article we want to address. First, though, you guys, a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, number 6 here from Bob. Why didn't the Broncos do this with Flacco earlier? Here's what Bob says, quote, first of all, the Broncos wanted to find out how well Flacco would look in practices and during the preseason before making a decision. That's really the bottom line. And even last week in John Elway's weekly Elway Access sit-down with Broncos TV, he said that up to this point, Joe Flacco has met every expectation that the brass had for him. So they waited to make that determination. Once they realized they liked what they've seen so far, they went ahead and made that move.
Yeah, that's their thinking, and they have to be with conviction in their moves and conviction in their thinking. And we can't really second guess them until this process plays out. You can look on Elway's history and his past and the failed quarterback moves, but you have to think based on the way he looked himself in the mirror this offseason, based on the way he's restructured this team, and the way he's changed the way he's done things and handled business, that he finally got the quarterback situation down pat.
Here's one that should really, these next 2 points, really interest Broncos country. 7. What does this mean for Drew Lock? Here's what Bob says, quote, I don't believe the Broncos are giving up on Drew Lock. They still see him as the quarterback of the future. It just means the future may not come as early as originally thought. Had Lock not sprained his thumb and went into the regular season healthy, it's possible the Broncos don't restructure Flacco's contract because Lock would have had the chance to practice and be in a better position to take over as the starter in 2020. I don't really disagree with that premise at all, Zach. Yep. I think that it's, the Broncos are basically protecting themselves, hedging against any kind of, Lock's development, being slowed by this thumb injury. So still, though, I think even the way they have this newly structured with Flacco, it gives them the opportunity to really see what Lock looks like next spring and early summer before making a final decision on Flacco.
Yeah, I was making this point a few minutes ago, and I definitely agree with it. If it's fair to wonder if Locke never got hurt, would the Broncos still have made this move to Flacco? We'll never know the answer, but I fully believe that he was on schedule or even maybe ahead of schedule and the way they wanted to go about next season. Considering how the offense looked with Flacco, it wasn't necessarily mind-blowing. So maybe Locke stays healthy, his development's on schedule, and he pushes Flacco for this job next year. Now it probably won't happen. Now he's behind in his development. Now he's behind in his progress. That injury, he has to wait 8 more weeks to practice at the minimum, and that just gives Flacco the more being the understood quarterback. So yeah, that's what it means for Drew Lock at the present moment.
All right, let's move to number 8. I even wrote when I did the news story on this, what is this? Why are the Broncos freeing up the cap space when they now have $12 million? Are they looking to make a move perhaps at left tackle just in case things, if Garrett Bowles craps the bed early week 1, you're probably going to get a pretty good beat on whether or not Bowles is taking that leap forward in year 3 under Mike Munchak. Could the Broncos now trade for Redskins left tackle Trent Williams? Here's what Bob says, quote, there's been some speculation that the Broncos could make a push to acquire left tackle Trent Williams from the Washington Redskins. The cap space the Broncos gained does open the door for such a trade. However, keep in mind that Williams is due a $10.85 million base salary this year. He's also certain to want an extension. And even in the extremely unlikely situation that he doesn't want an extension, the Broncos would have to extend him because that $10.85 million in salary would take up the bulk of the remaining cap space the Broncos freed. So last thing Bob says here, while I did rule out trading for Williams earlier in the offseason, I won't rule it out entirely now, but I would wait it out for 2 important reasons. First, the Broncos need to see how they do in the coming weeks and determine if they have a legit shot at the playoffs. If they do, it would make more sense to trade for Williams. And second, the Redskins are telling other teams they don't want to trade Williams. Quote, we don't want to trade a player, unquote, is code for, quote, we have to set our price at a point that nobody wants to meet. In other words, they're asking for too much in a trade. What are your thoughts on this as it regards the Broncos perhaps taking a look at Williams?
In my humble opinion, I can rule it out safely. I mean, you invested a first-round pick on Garrett Bowles. Like you said, Chad, you're kind of waiting to see how he's going to be in his all-important third year. You just blew NFL record money at the time on a right tackle in Juwan James. I mean, you're committed at those positions. And then you're going to bring on another highly paid tackle who literally quit on his team and is holding out into the regular season. Why would you usher that into the locker room. Why would you add that into the equation with Vic Fangio, the most old school guy, no nonsense guy? It just doesn't make sense on a financial level or a personnel level. I don't see Trent Williams coming to Denver in any scenario.
All right, I'm going to skip number 9, let you guys go read this article. Number 10, and then we'll move on to a couple of quick questions and get out of here. What does this mean for 2020? Here's what Bob says. First, I believe the Broncos will keep Flacco in 2020. That means my offseason game plan for 2020 that I discussed a few days ago doesn't change on that point. Second, the Broncos will still have plenty of cap space to work with, so they can still extend Shelby Harris and Justin Simmons and then add other free agents as desired. The team can gain additional cap space by declining Ronald Leary's team option, and the door could still be open for bringing back players who test the market but maybe don't find deals to their liking, whether that's a Chris Harris, whether that's a Will Parks. There's plenty of other candidates. But really, I think for 2020, this just is, it doesn't really change too much other than the Broncos still have an out if Flacco fails this year, or they feel like, you know, they're more inclined to invest in Drew Lock next season.
Yeah, and what it means for 2020, at least in my opinion, is now you have the money to sign that talent before 2020 and for 2020 and for 2020 and beyond. You lock them down now. You get them locked into a below or at market rate value and not let their price skyrocket. Let's say Shelby Harris has a huge season. Justin Simmons has a huge season. They're going to want big money on the open market. Chris Harris Jr. too. What it means for 2020 is you give the opportunity ahead of time to lock down the talent now. I would just be surprised, Chad, and I could be wrong, if they didn't free up this money to, you know, retain their own talent and not look outside.
Yeah. I mean, bottom line, it gives them a little more flexibility to make moves this year if they need to. They now have a little bit of breathing room, and it doesn't really change anything in terms of their long-term commitment to Joe Flacco. So the Drew Lock being the future of the team window is still wide open, and it really comes down to two things. Does Joe Flacco elevate this team in 2019, and does Drew Lock, even though he's on IR at least for the next 8 weeks, does he show enough between now and next June 1st to bounce Flacco off this roster? None of that has changed. So let's turn the page, grab a couple of questions, one from YouTube, one from Twitter. As always, Zach and I are your football priests, and each and every week we're going to be here to offer you the absolution and answers to your burning Broncos questions. This first one here comes from Twitter, from great listener, longtime listener, Jedi Joshua 58. He says, with the cap space opened up and wanting to compete this year, do you guys think Elway should try to make a trade for an inside linebacker? A tackle would be too expensive probably, but ILB is probably our biggest weakness on defense. Thoughts? Zach, your answer for Josh.
It's something we've touched on multiple times in multiple pods this offseason. I'm of the opinion they should have solidified that spot with a veteran pickup, either in the draft or free agency. They can't do that really now. Not a lot of options out there. I don't see it happening, though. I really think Fangio and Elway are content with Todd Davis, Josie Jewell as starters, and they're not freaking out about Davis' injury just yet. They like the backup talent they have on the roster, they have on the practice squad, they have around the team. I don't see a trade for an inside linebacker, barring another injury or a worse setback for Todd Davis.
Yeah, and you got to remember, too, Josh, that teams out there who have a viable or an interesting player, or player, I should say, at inside linebacker that would interest outside teams via the trade market, these are teams now that are committed to and need these off-ball linebackers. Now, there might be some situations around the league we'd have to go case by case and look at whether or not there is enough depth on an inside linebacker depth chart to justify a team being willing to put a guy on the trading block. But it's at this point, in most cases, now there's always exceptions, but in most cases, the players that are on a 53-man roster, they're there because the team is counting on them this year. So doesn't rule out the possibility. I mean, the Broncos still have another month and a half before the trade deadline, but it's something to keep in mind and something we'll be monitoring as we get further into the regular season. Now, last question, then we'll get out of here. This one comes from YouTube, from Mike Oz. He says, I'd love a comparison of this current 2019 Broncos roster to the Broncos rosters of previous years. Try to find the closest comparison you can. Mike, I gave this a little bit of thought, and I don't mean to, draw any connotations here or make you think this is any kind of bold prediction, but this roster reminds me a lot of the 2015 squad that went on to win the championship. And here's what I mean by that. You got a former Super Bowl MVP quarterback, who at this point in 2015, the Broncos, Peyton Manning, had only won one Super Bowl, right, with the Colts back in 2006. Super Bowl MVP of that game. Flacco at this stage, same thing. He's got one Super Bowl ring, and he was the Super Bowl MVP. Maybe a little, not quite. No, it's about the same in terms of distance, how far away they were from when they won that world championship. Bottom line, though, is you've got kind of an underrated guy. You might question his age. You might question whether he's lost any of the mustard on his fastball, but he's got the ability to win. He's won games in the league. Defensively, Zach, if you look across the board, I mean, that 2015 roster, defensively, one of the best of all time. Now, it's way too early to say that about the 2019 counterpart. However, if you go position by position, DeMarcus Ware, now you got Bradley Chubb. Von Miller, still Von Miller. The defensive line, we'll see whether or not Adam Gotsis can take a step forward in 2019 in the same way that Malik Jackson did in 2015. Nose tackle, you had Sylvester Williams as your starter that year in 2015. This year, you got Shelby Harris, two guys who have a chance. Williams had a chance that year to take a step forward. Got a free agent deal the next year. Didn't quite work out the way he wanted, or maybe it was the year after that. I can't remember exactly when Williams left now off the top of my head. But Harris, sitting in a contract year, now kind of an unquestioned starter, has a chance to take a step forward. And then you look at the secondary. The only difference, I think, is the linebackers were more proven for the Broncos, but not so much proven. They're proven in hindsight, I guess, Zach, because Danny Trevathan and Brandon Marshall, those years were their coming out parties. So it remains to be seen whether or not the same will hold true for Todd Davis and Josie Jewell. But what's your answer?
Chad, you nailed it pretty well there. I was going to say they remind me something of the 2015 team, 2014. And like you, I don't mean that to say they're going to be a playoff contender, a Super Bowl contender. They just have certain things in place that harken back to those teams. They have a good, competent defensive coaching staff. They have a veteran quarterback who's experienced under center. They have a stocked roster, or at least, more stocked compared to what it was the last couple of years. There are certain breadcrumbs that lead you to believe they could be something along those lines. But they're going to be their own team. They're going to be the 2019 Broncos, and it's going to be ups and downs. It's not going to be anything exact to what we've seen in the past. They're going to kind of forge their own identity and make their own story this year. But if you're looking for some sort of comparison, gun to my head, I would say 2014, 2015 Broncos for those reasons.
All right. Well, hey, guys, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Huddle Up Podcast. We hope you guys have all enjoyed the opening week of the NFL. Hope your fantasy team's crushed out there. We'll see how things shake out in the MHH Fantasy League that is being commissioned by my partner in crime here, Zack Kelberman. Make sure you got your ducks in a row there, all of you team owners. But we will be back tomorrow for the gut reaction to what happens as you guys are listening to this tonight in the Monday Night Football game between the Denver Broncos and Oakland Raiders. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, make sure you're following the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. You can find my partner, Zack Kelberman, on Twitter at KelbermanNFL. Myself at Chad and Jensen. Let's hope the Denver Broncos come out and make a statement in front of a nationally televised audience and keep pace with the Chiefs and the Chargers. For Zack Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We'll talk to you guys tomorrow.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.